folks. Today we're going to be going over Chapter 40, Population Ecology. I think it's key for you to know that the majority of your exam questions are either going to be examples that I give in this lecture or key terms. So I highly recommend for you to prepare for your exam 3 in that you make some flashcards and know the vocabulary from this chapter. So back in Biology 105, we learned that population is a group of interbreeding individuals of the same species in a specified area. And one example, which you can see from this YouTube video, is you guys. So where does everyone live? Do Nichols State students date one another or folks in nearby towns? Do you all eat together? Do you all interact with each other on an everyday basis? You're the same species and you live in the same towns usually, or you're living on campus, and you're interacting constantly and potentially interbreeding as well. So student learning objectives, you guys need to learn the language associated with the study of population, aka know the vocabulary from this chapter, understand the factors that affect population density, distribution, and change, understand the meaning of exponential growth, understand the significance and use of life tables, and interpret survivorship curves, know the impacts of the growth of human populations, and tell which factors have encouraged growth in some cultures and limited growth in others. So several different Canadian goose populations spend time in the U.S. Some migrate and some do not. Non-migratory populations, those are ones that live here year-round, devote more energy to producing young, and their numbers are increasing. And that's because they don't spend so much time migrating. Wildlife managers are looking for ways to reduce non-migratory goose populations without harming migratory birds because they're basically taking over all the resources for those migratory birds. So a population is a group of organisms of the same species that live in the same area and interbreed. Ecological factors affect the size, the density, the distribution, and age structure of a population. For example, if you think about everyone who lives in New Orleans today, what was it like right after Katrina? Those would be factors that affected the population. So studying population ecology often involves the use of demographics, which often change over time. And demographics are statistics that describe a population. Biologists frequently use sampling techniques to estimate a population size. Plot sampling estimates the total number of individuals in an area based on direct counts in a small portion of the area. For example, how many dusky gopher frogs are in the bayou? What a scientist might do is they might go out in the bayou a couple of days and they will try to count as many frogs as they can find. And then they're going to estimate from the plot sampling where these organisms, how many of these organisms might be in the bayou. Estimates from plot sampling are most accurate when the organisms counted are not very mobile and conditions across the area they occupy are more or less uniform. And if you wonder why, that's because if your organism that you're counting, like these frogs, if they migrate or they move very quickly, you might not be doing a very good sample population. And if conditions across the area they occupy are not uniform, you might find more gopher frogs in one part of the bayou than other parts. And that's going to mess up the population size estimate. So key terms of population size is the total number of individuals in a population. And plot sampling is a method of estimating population size of organisms that do not move much by making counts in small plots and extrapolating from this to the number in the larger area. Also, scientists sometimes use mark and recapturing sampling to estimate the population size of mobile animals. You see this a lot with sharks and dolphins, and also in the Florida Keys, they use this with deer. Marking and recapturing sampling is a method of estimating the population size of mobile animals by marking individuals, releasing them, and then checking the proportion of marks among individuals recaptured at a later time. Population density and distribution. Population density is the number of individuals per unit area or volume. For example, there is a much greater population density of dandelions in this yard than there are in this yard. Population distribution is a little bit different. This describes how individuals are distributed in a specific area. Individuals may be clumped, they may be uniformly dispersed or randomly dispersed in the area. And I do expect you guys to know the differences between these three. Clump distribution is the most common form of distribution. Let me repeat that again. Clumped distribution is the most common form of distribution. So when I ask you that on the exam, please get it right. Individuals are closer to one another than would be predicted by chance alone. And usually this is because of a resource distribution is limited. So for example, you're going to find a bunch of hippopotamuses near water. They're not going to be evenly distributed throughout Africa. They're going to be all hanging out around water. Or these prairie dogs like to hang out in clump distributions around food and easy areas to build their homes. Oops. Near uniform distribution is very rare, and when this occurs, it's because of intense competition for a limited resource. So, for example, these bushes in the desert will live uniformly, or you see these birds breeding and they've nested uniformly. That's because there's not a lot of resources for them. So, another one would be in humans. So, I grew up in an area where all the homes were uniformly distributed like this, and that's because land was so hard to find. And so what they did was, to make the most of the land, they would evenly distribute homes across a couple acres. And then finally we have random distribution. These are individuals that are distributed randomly when environmental resources are uniformly distributed and proximity to others is neither beneficial nor harmful. For example, if you were to blow on this dandelion, the wind is going to carry those seeds, and wherever they land is where that new dandelion is going to grow. And so that would be a random distribution. We also look at age structure when we're talking about populations. Individuals in a population are frequently grouped as pre-reproductive, reproductive, and post-reproductive. So age structure of a population is the number of individuals in each of the several age categories. For example, the way I always think about it is you think about in American schools. So in elementary school, we are pre-reproductive. And then once you get into middle and high school, we're of reproductive age. And then once we're hanging out in our retirement homes, we will be post-reproductive. A reproductive base is a population where all individuals who are of reproductive age or younger. So think about Nicholls State. We are a reproductive base because the majority of individuals that work and attend Nicholls State are of reproductive age, which means that they can have children. So key concepts. Ecologists explain population growth in terms of population size, density, distribution, and number of individuals in the different age categories. Can you describe these terms? And they also have methods of estimating population size and density in the field, and they do this through plot sampling. So population size can grow and shrink, and the way it usually happens is through immigration and emigration. So the number of individuals in a population is increased by births and by immigration, and decreased by deaths and emigration. So immigration with an I is the movement of individuals into a population, and emigration is the movement of individuals out of a population. And the video below is going to show you how humans have immigrated and emigrated over the thousands of years we've occupied this planet, to explain how man got to the United States. You should also be aware that right now, like literally right now, we are going through one of the largest human immigration and emigration movements. You might not see this in the United States, but across Europe and Africa and the Middle East, there are huge movements of populations right now, usually people leaving Syria and other Middle Eastern countries due to war and famine. Apart from immigration and emigration, an interval in which population size remains unchanged with no net increase or decrease is called zero population growth. So zero population growth means that, let's say we're talking about a mouse colony, that each month 100 mice are born and each month 100 mice pass. So there's no growth of that population because the same amount are being born as the same that are dying. We also can describe growth rate. We can measure births and deaths in terms of rates per individual or per capita. So per capita growth rate is basically the per capita birth rate and per capita death rate. And what you do is you take the birth rate and you subtract it from the death rate. So per capita growth rate for some interval, so some time period like 10 years, the added number of individuals divided by the initial population size. And here's just an example. I will not expect you guys to do math on your exam, so you don't have to worry about this. As long as the R remains constant and greater than 0, so that means as long as your birth rate is going to be greater than 0, you're going to have exponential growth. So population grows exponentially as long as the birth rate is greater than the death rate. So exponential growth is a population that grows by a fixed percentage in a successive time interval, and the size of each increase is determined by the current population size. Here are some really great examples. The number of new individuals increases with each generation. So here I'm showing you guys bacterial cells. Here's one cell. It's going to divide into 2 cells. Each of these 2 cells is then going to divide into 2 cells. Each of these 2 cells is going to divide into another 2 cells, and so on and so forth. And what you have is that each generation adds to the population, leading to exponential growth. Under ideal conditions, which means that all individuals have shelter, food, and other essential resources, no predators and no pathogens or germs to make you sick, a population's growth is going to reach its biotic potential. Now, in the real world, there's no such thing as a biotic potential because there's always going to be some problem. Someone's going to get sick, someone's going to go hungry, there's not going to be enough shelter for everyone. But the biotic potential is the maximum possible population growth rate under optimal conditions. So if there were no predators, no disease, plenty of food and housing, then you would have a biotic potential. So key concepts. Exponential rates of growth. Population size and reproductive base influence its rate of growth. As long as births exceed deaths, a population will grow exponentially, and each generation will be larger than the preceding one. Now, there are limits on population growth. Populations seldom reach their biotic potential because of the effects of limiting factors. There are many complex interactions that take place within and between populations in nature. It is not always easy to identify all the factors that can restrict a population growth. So a limiting factor is a necessary resource and the depletion of which halts population growth. So think about it. What are human limiting factors? What would stop our population from growing? One would be if we didn't have enough shelter for everyone, or enough clothing, or enough food, or if a disease were to wipe out a population. Environmental limits on growth. Essential resources such as food, minerals, refuge from predators, and safe nesting sites are examples of limiting factors for population growth. In any environment, one essential factor will run out first and act as the brake on population growth. So supplying the first limiting factor simply substitutes one for another. All natural populations eventually encounter some sort of limit. So one example would be drought or fire. A given environment can sustain only a certain number of individuals in a population indefinitely. Ultimately, the sustainability supply of resources is going to determine the population size, right? If you have a fish tank, there's only so many fish that are going to be able to live in there. And if you give them a limited amount of food, eventually, even if those fish breed and populate that tank, there's only a limited amount of space and there's only a limited amount of food. So the carrying capacity is the maximum number of individuals of a species that an environment can sustain. And the way I think about this is you have a fish tank, it's the maximum number of fish that you can keep alive and healthy in that fish tank. There's a pattern of logistic growth that shows that a small population starts growing very slowly. So if there's only a few individuals in that population, but then all of a sudden they're going to grow very rapidly or exponentially. And then all of a sudden they're going to level off to the carrying capacity that is reached. So the logistic growth plot is an S-shaped curve, which you can see here. And what a logistic growth is a population that grows slowly and then increases rapidly until it reaches its carrying capacity and levels off. Factors that affect population growth fall into 2 categories, and I expect you to know these 2 categories and examples of them because they will be on your exam. The first is density-dependent factor. That's a factor that limits population growth and has a greater effect in dense populations than less dense ones. So for example, the flu. The flu is a pathogen, and what happens is if someone comes into a classroom with 150 people in it with the flu and starts spreading it, more people are going to get the flu than if that person went into a classroom with only 5 people in it. A density-independent factor is a factor that limits population growth and arises regardless of how big that population is. So, for example, fires and earthquakes. Those are going to happen despite if a lot of people live there or not. So here's again, density-dependent factors. These are factors that limit population growth and has a greater effect on dense populations than less dense ones. Here's an example of one: the Ebola outbreak that's been happening over the past few years. Usually, Ebola outbreaks occur in small, isolated villages. So you might hear it on the news, and then all of a sudden, Ebola goes away. However, the most recent outbreak occurred in Liberia, in a bustling port city with poor infrastructure. And so what happened was you have a ton of people here, and you have poor sewage, you don't have very much electricity or running water, and so Ebola spread very, very quickly. Versus when you have an Ebola outbreak in a very small town in maybe the Congo. Density independent factors are factors that limit population growth and arise regardless of the population density. For example, the California drought we had the past few years, or the wildfires that are going on right now, or the Houston flood. That flood is going to happen despite if people live there or not. Here's an example called overshoot and crash. Here's an example of density dependent factors, which are in red, and independent factors, which are in blue. In 1944, 29 reindeer were introduced on an island called St. Matthew Island. In 1957, 1,350 well-fed reindeer were munching on a food source called lichen. However, because there were so many reindeer, eventually they ate all the lichen, and in 1963, there were 6,000 hungry reindeer, which means that they exceeded their carrying capacity. When there's no more food left, many of them died. But then there was an especially cold and snowy winter, and many of the reindeer also could not survive, leading to no reindeer by the 1980s. So a density dependent factor would be the fact that there was no more food, and density independent factor would be the weather. So key concepts. Density dependent factors such as competition for resources lead to logistic growth. A population grows exponentially at first, then growth slows as the number approaches the environment's carrying capacity. Please know what this is called. And can you differentiate between density dependent and independent factors? Let's talk about our life history patterns. Age at maturity, number of offspring or kids per reproductive event, and lifespan affect a population's growth. Reproduction-related events that occur between birth and death make up our life history pattern. So our life history pattern is a set of traits related to growth, survival, reproduction, such as lifespan, age-specific mortality, age at first reproduction, and number of breeding events. We study life history traits within a population by recording what happens in a specific cohort. So human life expectancy tables are usually based on information about a current condition rather than a real cohort. And cohort is a group of individuals born during the same time. Many of you are considered millennials, and you are all part of the same cohort. So this is the average life expectancy through history. And you can see that during the Renaissance, if you made it to 30, that's old. So I'm over the age of 30, and so I would be ancient in the Renaissance. In 1850, if you made it to 43, you were pretty much considered old. And then in America today, if you make it to 78, you're doing pretty good. And we are expected to live past 100. Information about age-specific death rates can also be summarized in a survivorship curve, which shows how many members of a cohort remain alive over time. So here you can see the red and the blue are females and males that were born before 1950, and then females and males that were born after 1950, and how many years that they live. And you can see the differences between folks that were born before and after the 1950s. There are 3 types of survivorship curves that are common, and I expect you to know each type and examples for each one. So this graph is showing you all 3. So there's a type 1, type 2, and type 3 survivorship curve. Type 1 survivorship curves are elephants and others that have low mortality until old age. So these are typically large animals, including ourselves, that bear one or few offspring at a time and provide extended parental care. So they live for a very long time before they die. A type 2 survivorship curve is going to be one where the death rate is fairly constant. So no matter how many offspring they have, they're going to be continually breeding and dying. An example would be birds like the snowy egret, or lizards and small mammals and some birds. So they are breeding, being born, and dying at a constant rate. And then the third survivorship curve means that they have high mortality early in life, But those that do survive will survive for a long time. So an example of this would be sea urchins, in which what they do is they release a bunch of larvae into the ocean, and whichever ones survive, those will live a long time. So many will die early on in life, but then those that survive are going to live a nice long time. So life history traits such as age at first reproduction and number of offspring per reproductive event vary and are shaped by natural selection. Adaptive life history traits are those that maximize an individual's lifetime reproductive success. Do you know those various survivor pattern curves? Don't worry about K&R selection because we did not go over that. Organisms continually adapt to environmental changes, and as when shifts in predation and pressure alter life history traits. An example would be a long-term study by evolutionary biologists that illustrates the effect of predation on a guppy life history traits. So let's talk about guppies. Guppies are these little fish. You probably see them in fish tanks at PetSmart, and they also are in the wild. Several populations of guppies live in a stream with many small waterfalls that serve as natural barriers. They can't get past the waterfalls. Different guppy populations face different predation pressures. Some populations live with killfish, a relatively small predator that eats mostly immature guppies. And here's a picture of a killfish. Other populations live with cichlids, which are larger and tend to eat mature guppies, which you can see right here. Guppies hunted by cichlids, those are the ones that eat the baby guppies, will grow faster and are smaller at maturity. They reproduce earlier and have more offspring at a time and breed more frequently than guppies hunted by killfish. Researchers found that these differences in life history traits are genetic and that predators acted as a selective agent that influenced the guppy's life history patterns. Compared to guppies raised with killfish, guppies raised with cichlids differed in size and length between broods. And the reason being is the guppies wanted to survive. So if guppies are going to be hanging out near killfish, they need to be bigger than what the killfish can eat. And if populations are hanging out with cichlids, they want to remain smaller so cichlids won't want to eat them. We've also had a major effect, as in humans have had a major effect on fish populations as well. In response to fishing pressure on larger fish, Atlantic codfish began maturing faster and reproducing younger. Fishermen prized larger fish so the smaller ones could survive at the time, and this is showing you the cod population between 1968 and 72 and 2003 to 2008. In 1992, we had a ban on cod fishing that came too late to stop the Atlantic cod population from crashing. I sometimes wonder, do you think that this could happen to crawfish? For most of history, the human population grew very slowly, but growth rate began to increase to about 10,000 years ago, and then soared during the past 2 centuries. And 3 trends promoted the large increase. And one of those trends you can see right here, which we use every day, the toilet. So humans are able to migrate into new habitats and expand into new climate zones. For example, during the potato famine, a bunch of people from Ireland would then come here to escape and have good food again. Humans developed new technologies that increase the carrying capacity of existing habitats. For example, humans learned how to farm, and farming led to making enough food for your population. And humans sidestep some limiting factors that restrain growth of other species. For example, infrastructure. We can pump water into a city and we can pump waste out. So plumbing, toilets, those all help with limiting factors. Human skills that override normal population limits include learn to start fires, build shelters, make clothing, manufacture tools, and cooperate in hunts. Language allowed knowledge to pass through generations. Agriculture provided more dependable food supply. Improved sanitation and medical advances, such as vaccines and antibiotics, cut the death toll from the disease. And energy of fossil fuels allowed development of mechanicalized agriculture to sustain the ever larger population. Imagine what happens to a population when you take away certain things like electricity, clean water, medications. Quality of life is inversely related to population growth, resource depletion, and population. Many governments now offer family planning programs to reduce fertility rates. Worldwide, total fertility rate has fallen from 6.5% in 1950 to 2.6% in 2008, and replacement fertility for developed countries is about 2.1%. So that means how many kids you are having in a relationship. Total fertility rate is the average number of children the woman of a population bear over the course of a lifetime. Imagine, my grandfather was one of 13. However, I'm an only child, so that is a hugely reduced total fertility rate. Replacement fertility rate is the average number of children women of a population must bear to replace themselves with a daughter of reproductive age. In some cultures, men are thought to be more valued than women. For example, back in the day when I was born, the Chinese culture felt that men were better than women, and so families would give daughters up for adoption, but keep their male offspring. Unfortunately, now China has a huge problem because there's not enough women to reproduce and replace their population. The world population is expected to reach 8.9 billion by 2050 and possibly decline as the century ends. China and India each hold more than 1 billion people, together 38% of the world population, and the United States is third with 307 million. Age structure diagrams show the distribution of individuals among age groups. The broader the base of an age structure diagram, the greater proportion of young people and the greater expected growth. So here in Guatemala, Nigeria, and Saudi Arabia, you have a very large reproductive base. However, in places like Germany, Bulgaria, and Russia, very few people are of reproductive age, and so they will not be able to replace the aging population that you see towards the top. More than 1/3 of the world's population is the broad pre-reproductive base. World population's growth can't be slowed for many years because 1.9 billion people are about to enter the reproductive age. The most highly developed countries have the lowest birth rates and infant mortality and highest life expectancy. For example, in Japan, in the United States, and more developed countries, women are waiting longer to have children and only are having one or two usually versus back in the day. But these children are expected to live because we have better medicine and infrastructure. Some countries in Europe, some members of the former Soviet Union and Japan currently have a negative population growth. Birth rate is lower than death rate. Why do you think that is in the Soviet Union or what is now Russia? Negative growth produces a population with more old people than young, a problem because older individuals have traditionally been supported by a larger, younger workforce, and the country's economy is going to need to be supported by a younger workforce. On a per capita basis, people in highly developed countries use far more resources than those in less developed countries and generate more waste and pollution. This is an awesome link. If you click on it, it shows what people in different cultures and countries eat and how much we waste. And it's absolutely fascinating to see what Americans eat compared to folks in other countries. Your ecological footprint is the area of Earth's surface required to sustainably support a particular level of development and consumption. People in China and India consume less than average, and the per capita footprint of the United States is more than 3 times the average. So that means that we consume way more resources than other people in the world. Billions of people in India and China and other less developed nations aspire to be like Americans. For everyone to live like an average American, 4 times the sustainable resources available on Earth would be required, which would be insane. The human population may already be living beyond its ecological means or the Earth's carrying capacity. So human populations have sidestepped historical limits of growth by way of global expansion in new habitats, cultural traits, and technological innovations. But no population can expand indefinitely, and we're starting to push our limits. These are your key terms, and then these are your student learning objectives. And like I said before, it's very important that you understand your key terms.